London, May 8, 1945. The streets explode in celebration. Winston Churchill appears on the balcony of Buckingham Palace alongside the royal family. Millions of Britons embrace soldiers, cry with relief, wave flags. Britain had just won World War II. The empire that controlled a quarter of the planet was standing, Berlin in ruins, Tokyo in flames, London victorious. But in the basements of the British Treasury, the numbers told another story. National debt had exploded to 250% of GDP, more than double the country's entire economy. The most powerful empire on earth was technically bankrupt, broke, dependent on American loans to buy bread, and no one wanted to admit it. It wasn't the Nazis who brought down the British Empire. It wasn't the bombings, it wasn't Hitler, it was debt, the invisible debt, the debt that grew silently while the world applauded victory. And today, right now, the United States is following the exact same script, word for word, number by number. But before we continue this story that will change how you see the dollar in your pocket, check if you're already subscribed to the channel and hit the bell. And write in the comments where you're watching this video from. I love knowing how far these stories reach. From New York, London, Sydney, tell me down below. Britain didn't build the largest empire in human history by accident. It wasn't luck. It wasn't just military force. It was something far more powerful, financial trust. At the height of the 19th century, London was the beating heart of the global economy. The City of London, that small square of a few kilometers on the banks of the Thames, controlled the flow of capital across the entire planet. The pound sterling was the universal currency. If you wanted to buy cotton in Alabama, coffee in Brazil, opium in China, or diamonds in South Africa, you paid in pounds. A quarter of humanity lived under the British flag, 412 million people. From Hong Kong to Bombay, from Cairo to the Cape of Good Hope, from Singapore to Kingston, the sun literally never set on the British Empire. And this domination wasn't maintained just by warships. It was maintained by three invisible pillars, but stronger than any army: gold, trust, and credit. First pillar, gold. The pound sterling was backed by physical gold. Every note you held represented real gold stored in the vaults of the Bank of England. This wasn't an empty promise. It was pure mathematics. You could literally exchange your pounds for gold at any time. Second pillar, global trust. Bankers from New York to Shanghai, from Buenos Aires to Bombay, believed in British stability. The Royal Navy ruled the oceans. The British legal system was respected. Contracts were honored. Debts were paid. Third pillar, the credit system. London didn't just store gold. It lent gold. It financed railways in Argentina, mines in South Africa, tea plantations in India, canals in Egypt, ports in Australia. The entire world was connected by a financial web that began and ended in London. But behind this perfect glory, something deadly was already growing, in silence. Sarajevo, June 28, 1914. One shot, one archduke dead, and the world collapses. World War I wasn't a war. It was an industrial meat grinder. 4 years of carnage, 10 million dead, 20 million wounded. Entire cities wiped off the map. And the cost? Astronomical. Britain spent £35 billion, a number no one could comprehend at the time. To put it in perspective, this was 10 times the annual national budget. And where did this money come from? It didn't come from anywhere, because it didn't exist. To finance the war, Britain did something it had never done before: abandoned the gold standard. It started printing money. Money without backing. Money based only on the promise that someday, maybe, perhaps, the government would pay it back. And more. It started taking loans, gigantic loans, and the main creditor, the United States. For the first time in modern history, Britain wasn't the owner of the money. It was the debtor. When the war ended in 1918, the richest empire in the world was in debt, deeply, and worse, the gold, the foundation of everything, was crossing the Atlantic in ships headed to New York. Britain's fatal error wasn't fighting World War I, it was believing it could return to what it was before the war. In the 1920s, the British government made a catastrophic decision. It tried to restore the gold standard. The logic seemed solid. If the pound returned to being backed by gold, global confidence would return. London would once again be the financial center of the world. The empire would regain its shine. There was just one little problem. The gold was gone. During the war, tons and tons of British gold were sent to the United States to pay for weapons, food, loans. London's vaults were dramatically emptier, and New York's were overflowing, but the British government pretended it didn't matter. It returned to the gold standard in 1925, fixing the pound at an artificially high value. The result? Disaster. British exports plummeted. After all, with the overvalued pound, British products became too expensive for the rest of the world. Factories began closing, unemployment exploded, and then came the crash of 1929, the Great Depression. The world economy imploded, banks collapsed, fortunes evaporated. Unemployment in Britain reached 20%. On the streets of London, suited men, former executives, former engineers, sold apples to survive. And how did the British government respond? With more debt, more spending, more promises it couldn't keep. In 1931, Britain was forced to abandon the gold standard again, this time permanently. The pound sterling, the most trusted currency in the world for over a century, became just paper. But the worst was still to come. September 1939, Hitler invades Poland. World War II begins, and this time the cost would be even more brutal. Churchill knew what was at stake. It wasn't just Britain's survival, it was the survival of Western civilization. He was willing to pay any price, and he did. The entire country was transformed into a gigantic war machine. Every factory, every ship, every man and woman mobilized. Everything producing, everything fighting, everything financed with money that didn't exist. Where did the money come from? From the United States. Again, the Lend-Lease Act allowed Britain to receive billions of dollars in weapons, food, fuel. But it wasn't free. It was a loan that would have to be repaid, with interest. Churchill knew exactly what was happening. He knew that every American tank, every bomber, every ton of wheat cost more than money. It cost sovereignty. He had a bitter phrase about it. "We are selling the empire to save the nation." And he was absolutely right. July 1944. The war hadn't ended yet, but the Allies were already planning the post-war world. In Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, representatives from 44 nations gathered to create a new global financial system, and there, in that room, the official transfer of power took place. The pound sterling was dethroned. The American dollar would be the new global reserve currency. Gold would be priced in dollars. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank would be headquartered in Washington, not London. The British Empire had no choice. It was broke, desperate, dependent on American loans. It had to accept. That's when the empire began to die, and no one noticed, because when the war ended in 1945, the headlines spoke of victory, the images showed celebration. But behind the scenes, the numbers told another story. British debt, 250% of GDP. The most powerful empire in modern history was bankrupt. The collapse of an empire never happens overnight. It's not like a building that crumbles. It's like a structure that rots from the inside out, brick by brick, until one day you look and realize nothing's left. Britain spent the following decades living this slow death. In the immediate years after the war, the British government desperately tried to keep up appearances. It still controlled colonies in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean. It still had the Royal Navy. It still had a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. It still had prestige. But underneath the surface, everything was cracking. The war ended in 1945, but food rationing in Britain continued until 1954. 9 years after the war ended, Britons were still standing in line with coupons to buy sugar, butter, meat. The empire that had fed the entire world now couldn't feed itself, but that still wasn't the worst part. India was called the jewel in the crown of Britain. 400 million people, economically vital, symbolically irreplaceable. In August 1947, Britain was forced to grant India independence, not out of generosity, out of exhaustion. It simply no longer had the money, energy, or moral legitimacy to maintain control. The partition of India resulted in one of the largest bloodbaths in modern history, between 1 and 2 million dead, 15 million displaced, Hindus massacring Muslims, Muslims massacring Hindus, Sikhs against everyone, and Britain watched helplessly. The jewel in the crown had escaped, and with it, much of the empire's reason for being. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal, the vital artery connecting the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, gateway to India, Persian Gulf oil, all Eastern trade. Britain couldn't allow this. It was a matter of imperial survival. So in collusion with France and Israel, it launched a military operation to retake the canal. It was a disaster. The United States, now the true global power, said no. Eisenhower publicly condemned the invasion, threatened to destroy the pound sterling in the currency market, cut financial support, and Britain had to retreat, humiliated, defeated, without firing hardly a shot. It was the moment when the entire world realized the British Empire was no longer in charge. Washington was. And the final blow was still to come. The 1970s were rock bottom, rampant inflation, general strikes, power blackouts, mountains of garbage accumulating on London streets because the garbage collectors were on strike, bodies unburied because the gravediggers were on strike. The British economy was in collapse, productivity plummeted, the pound sterling lost value month after month, and in 1976, the unthinkable happened. The British government requested a bailout from the International Monetary Fund. Read that again. The British Empire, which had financed the entire world for 2 centuries, which had built railways in Argentina and ports in China, was begging for alms from the IMF. The amount? £2.3 billion. At the time, the largest bailout in IMF history, and it came with conditions: drastic spending cuts, tax increases, structural reforms. Britain's economic sovereignty was being dictated by bureaucrats in Washington. In 1979, Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister with a brutal but honest message. The money's run out. We don't have any more. The empire is over. We need to accept reality. Thatcher privatized state-owned companies, cut social spending, broke the power of unions, even sold British gold at the worst possible prices to try to stabilize the accounts. It was painful, it was traumatic, but it was necessary. Because the truth was inescapable. Britain had tried to be too great for too long with too little money, and it paid the ultimate price: loss of financial sovereignty. Now close your eyes and imagine the final scenes of this tragedy. Pound sterling coins piling up in drawers, worth less and less. London markets, once the busiest on the planet, now silent as New York steals the business. British warships, the same ones that defeated the Spanish Armada that dominated the Seven Seas, being sold as scrap to pay debts. Big Ben keeps chiming. Buckingham Palace still stands. The Queen still waves. But the real power? Changed address. Dusty libraries full of old maps, all painted pink, the colour of the British Empire. Canada, pink. Australia, pink. India, pink. All of Africa, pink. But now, just memory. Palaces full. Vaults empty. Flags still flutter over the Tower of London. But the gold inside? Sold decades ago. And the world watched in silence as the greatest empire in modern history transformed into an indebted island trying to pay the bills of the past. An empire that had controlled a quarter of the planet now had to negotiate trade deals like any small nation. An empire that had dictated global financial rules now followed orders from the IMF. And now look at the United States. Look carefully. Because if you know where to look, you'll see the same script being rewritten in real time. American national debt. $35 trillion, 35 trillion. To put it in perspective, that's more than 120% of American GDP, and growing every second, literally. While you watch this video, US debt grows about $1 million every 30 seconds. Just the interest on that debt has already exceeded $1 trillion per year. That's more than the entire defense budget. More than the US spends on education, infrastructure, and healthcare combined. Rome had 200% debt to GDP when it collapsed. Britain had 250%. The US is at 120% and rising. The dollar is still the global reserve currency. About 60% of world foreign exchange reserves are still in dollars, but that percentage is falling. In 2000 it was 70%. Today it's 60%, and the trend is downward. Why? Because trust is cracking. China is buying gold in record quantities. Russia reduced its dollar reserves from 40% to less than 10%. Saudi Arabia, an American ally for decades, is negotiating to sell oil in Chinese yuan. The BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are developing alternative payment systems to SWIFT, the dollar-dominated global transaction system. It's not a revolution, it's erosion, slow, constant, invisible to those not paying attention, exactly like it was with the pound sterling between 1945 and 1976. Britain collapsed because it tried to maintain a global empire without having the money for it. The United States is doing exactly the same thing. 800 military bases in 80 countries, endless wars in Afghanistan, 20 years, Iraq, invasion, withdrawal, return, Syria, Libya, Yemen. Total costs? Trillions of dollars. And for what? Afghanistan fell back to the Taliban within weeks. Iraq is a fragile state dominated by Iranian influence. Libya is a failed state. Trillions spent. Thousands of lives lost, and no clear strategic objective achieved. Meanwhile at home, deteriorated infrastructure, falling bridges, contaminated water systems, remember Flint, extremely expensive healthcare system, $1.7 trillion in student debt. The empire is bleeding money to maintain empire status, exactly like Britain did. In 2008, during the financial crisis, the Federal Reserve printed trillions in dollars. They called it quantitative easing. Nice name for an ugly thing, creating money out of nothing. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, they did it again. More trillions printed, stimulus checks, forgiven loans, bailout programs. And guess the result? Inflation, the highest in 40 years, food prices skyrocketing, gas through the roof, rent unattainable. Britain did this in the 1970s. Weimar Germany did it in the 1920s. Rome did it in the 3rd century. And every time the result is the same. Erosion of purchasing power, loss of trust, collapse. Britain thought it was too big to fail, that the empire was eternal, that the sun would never set, that the pound would always be king, that the world would always trust. Until it didn't anymore. The United States thinks it's too big to fail, that the dollar is irreplaceable, that it will always be the only superpower, that it can print money infinitely without consequences. History says otherwise. And today we're repeating the same story, only the names of the currencies have changed. But there's a difference between Britain and the United States, a terrifying difference. When Britain fell, there was someone to take over, the United States, a democracy, a stable power, an ally. But when the United States falls, and history suggests it will, who takes over? China? An authoritarian one-party state? A global digital currency controlled by algorithms? A chaotic multipolar system with no clear leadership? No one knows. But history has already shown exactly how this type of transition happens. Pain, chaos, wars, economic collapses, and we're on our way. When money dies, everything else dies with it. Trust, sovereignty, power, the illusion of greatness. The British Empire didn't fall because of wars. It wasn't militarily defeated. It won both world wars. It fell because it tried to maintain a global empire with a debt it couldn't pay. It fell because it chose appearance over reality. It fell because it believed its own illusion. And when the illusion shattered, nothing remained but an indebted, nostalgic island trying to understand where it all went wrong. The lesson Britain left is clear. No empire survives when trust in its currency runs out. It doesn't matter how powerful you are. It doesn't matter how many tanks you have. It doesn't matter how many aircraft carriers sail under your flag. When the world stops believing in your money, you stop being an empire. And the process isn't instantaneous, it's slow, invisible, imperceptible to those inside it. You wake up one day thinking you're a global power. And when you realize it, you're negotiating trade deals like any ordinary nation. You're asking the IMF for loans. You're selling gold to pay interest. Global power isn't lost overnight. It drains away, slowly, silently, until one day you wake up and realize the throne is empty, and the United States, it's following the script, scene by scene, act by act, growing debt, global trust cracking, unsustainable imperial spending, infinite money printing, the same mistakes, the same illusions, the same end. The only question is when, and who pays the bill? And the answer is always the same throughout history. Ordinary people, you, me, those who save money, who work, who trust. Because when empires collapse, it's not the emperors who suffer. It's the citizens who wake up one day and discover that everything they saved has turned into worthless paper. And the next empire in our series will show you something even more shocking. A civilization that seemed eternal and fell because of taxes, corruption, mismanagement. You won't want to miss this story. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, share this video, because history is repeating itself now, at this moment, and you need to know how it ends, because those who don't know history are condemned to repeat it, and those who do have the chance to prepare. The choice is yours.